So thank you so much for joining us today. We will not have a Q&A at the end of this panel or the next presentation, sorry. But if you have any question for our panelists, please feel free to stay for the reception at 7 p.m. in the atrium right outside of the gallery. They will be able to answer all your burning questions at that point. The exhibition that we have currently in the gallery is called Ringgold Tsar Meeting on the Matrix and will be open until May 22nd. So if you have the chance to come back and take a good look at it, because this is a little hectic today, we would love to have you come back. So I am now going to let this mic to Dr. David Bergen, who's going to introduce our panelists today.
Thank you, Clea. Can you hear me in the back? Great, thank you. As an art historian and a member of the advisory board here at the David C. Driskell Center, it is a great honor and a pleasure to introduce printmaking as expression of culture and identity. Presented in conjunction with the Driskell Center's current exhibition of prints by Faith Ringgold and Betty Saar and Howard University's James A. Porter Colloquium on African American art and art of the African diaspora, this evening's topic is endlessly important and fascinating. Tonight, we are privileged to learn from two renowned artists, educators, and speakers, Curlee Raven Holton and LaToya Hobbs. Printmaking is an art form that allows for the creation of original works of art that can be distributed to multiple collectors or institutions. While printmaking dates back to antiquity in Western and Asian cultures, the invention of the printing press in 15th century Europe enabled the dissemination of visual culture the same way that it facilitated the wider distribution of knowledge through the written word in printed books and broadsides. Because printmaking results in multiples, it has been a relatively democratic method of art making that has not been limited to a narrow audience of the wealthy and powerful, whether religious, political, or economic elites. Instead, the production of multiples from a single plate, woodblock, silkscreen, or other matrix has made individual impressions more affordable. Printmaking is a powerful tool for political expression. Critiques of war, abuses of power, exposure of poverty, and social injustice are among the many themes of printmakers across time. As well, printmaking helps to express and affirm racial, ethnic, gender, and other forms of cultural identity. For this reason, printmaking has often been the art form of choice for many women, artists of color, and LGBTQ artists. Our speakers today are both accomplished printmakers. LaToya Hobbs is a Baltimore-based artist and professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, one of the oldest art schools in the United States. She creates beautiful woodcuts, linocuts, and monotypes, often on an ambitiously large scale, that celebrate Black beauty and the cultural identity of women. Her work has been exhibited in the United States and Africa and has been collected by institutions and private collectors. Curlee Holton is a painter, printmaker, educator, and cultural leader. His artwork spans a range of themes related to African American culture and identity, jazz music, spirituality, slavery, and everyday life, for example. Holton learned the potential for collaborative printmaking from Robert Blackburn, who was the pioneer of bringing artists together, often from different disciplines, to create something that neither one could do alone. Holton has followed Blackburn's example and founded two presses. As founding director, Holton led the Experimental Printmaking Institute at Lafayette College for more than 2 decades. He printed editions with such renowned artists as David Driskell, Faith Ringgold, Sam Gilliam, Willie Cole, who's here with us this evening, and many, many other artists. In 2012, Curlee accepted the role of executive director of the David C. Driskell Center, and for many years, he led both EPI and the Driskell Center simultaneously. Curlee was energized by that unique opportunity, and he managed to activate both institutions at a geometric rather than an arithmetic pace. Under Curlee's leadership, the Driskell Center has become a national leader in developing exhibitions about African American art and artists, and the resulting publications provide a lasting legacy of that work and a record on which future generations of scholars can continue to build. Private collectors have entrusted Curlee and the Driskell Center to present works of art in their possession to the public that otherwise would have remained relatively unknown. He has mentored young artists and aspiring scholars and curators, demonstrated again and again his generosity of spirit. In 2006, he founded Raven Fine Art Editions, where he extends the Blackburn EPI tradition of collaborative printmaking. In 2021, he joined the Board of Counselors at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where I'm currently the CEO, and in that capacity, he has initiated a new artist-in-residence program and is currently working with Willie Cole and Mel Edwards to create new editions inspired by rare documents relating to African American history and culture in HSP's collections. I could go on, but it is time to hear from our accomplished speakers, LaToya Hobbs and Curlee Holton. Please join me in applauding our artists and speakers.
Me? Is that okay? Great. Perfect. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thanks to Dr. Brigham for the introduction. Normally, I'm talking about my practice as an artist in the Driskell Center, so I'm really excited about having this opportunity to put LaToya on the spot and have her talk about her practice and her work as an artist. I've known LaToya for some years and have always had high regard for her artistic practice. She was part of an international exhibition I organized at the American Consulate in San Jose, Costa Rica. She traveled there as well, along with other participating artists. Her work is large as life itself. She has distinguished herself both nationally and internationally with awards and museum exhibitions. An example of her exceptional work is displayed here with the work titled Kelly R. 2012 that the Driskell Center and the University of Maryland Art Gallery acquired recently together for our permanent collection. Today, I would like to bring the conversation a bit closer to home regarding her artistic motivation and strategies of her practice. All too often, we ask artists to talk about when they decide to become an artist, how long it takes to make a work of art, some of their motivations, but I think there's underpinnings that have driven artists to practice. And I think those issues should be investigated. And they're not often investigated, so we're going to try to do some of that today. I got a call from LaToya in preparation, and I told her I wouldn't tell her any of my questions, that I was going to put her on the spot and get right to it. So I'm going to start by asking her to just talk about the piece Kelly R. here as a subject, and why you selected her as your vehicle of creative expression in this particular piece.
Hi, first of all, thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. This particular piece was from a series that I did called Beautiful Uprising. I was really exploring what I like to describe as the intersection of race, beauty, and identity, particularly concerning Black women and women of the larger diaspora. So my goal was to really just showcase the versatility and variety of how we define beauty within our culture. And a lot of my work was specifically revolved around hair culture within the Black community, also this idea of colorism or skin complexion, and also just how we perceive ourselves and our bodies. So during this time, I was a graduate student at Purdue University, where I was getting my MFA, specifically focusing on printmaking, but I was just taking time to really document women who spoke to me. And so this person in particular was someone who I was dancing with. I was a member of the Jahari dance troupe at the time, and Kelly, she just had such confidence in her body and in the way she described herself as a dancer. She does not have this quote-unquote dancer body type. Typically when you think of dancers, there's kind of you have to be tall and slender and all those things, and she kind of embodied the opposite of that. But she had this confidence that I was just drawn to, and so she was somebody that I wanted to use as a subject. And so also during that time, I was exclusively focusing on printmaking. I was still painting at the time, but I was really focusing on printmaking as a subject. And I think printmaking in general just provides me a type of problem solving that isn't present in other types of media. With my drawing, sometimes it's it was like technically good, but almost kind of safe and predictable. But I think trying to translate an image through woodcut, right? Trying to do something that is like soft or voluptuous in those ways, it presents a different type of like problem solving that I find personally intriguing.
Could you talk just a little bit about the process in this particular piece? You talked about the subject matter and the idea of her monumentality, how large she is as not just her scale and body type, but that she is so prominent and it's important, I think significant. But also about the making of the object, use of wood, the carving, the labor that's involved. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the process of printmaking, I just kind of been reading the text as I look around the room, and I'm so glad that like there's explanations of the various aspects that go into printmaking, because it's a very process-oriented medium, and I feel like it's one of the genres of art that people are the least familiar with. So I find myself often having to explain what it means to be a printmaker, or what I mean when I say that I make prints. Most people think that I'm making like giclées or taking a painting, photographing that, and making a reproduction of it, but it's very different. So any type of printmaking process starts with what we call is the matrix. And if you look over here on the board there's a really good definition of a matrix. But it's basically the surface that you're using to construct your image. With my particular type of printmaking, we call it relief. I do woodcuts, and so usually there's some type of surface of wood that's involved. Right now I currently use cherry wood, but this particular piece was done on MDF, or it's also called microdensity fiber. But you start by developing your image. So normally I just draw like as if I were drawing to do a painting or to do like a really detailed graphite drawing. From there, a series of carving tools are applied. And so I'm literally taking away from the surface. So when you look at this piece, everything you see that is like white or the tone of the paper, that was created by me carving away from the surface of the block. And then whatever is left is inked up. So you take a roller, or we call it a brayer, you apply ink over the entire surface, you put paper on top of the print, and then you run that through a printing press, or you can also print by hand. But you need some type of pressure to be applied to the block to transfer the ink from the block to the paper. And then you do that process over and over again until you create your edition. And so the edition is basically the amount of impressions or the amount of prints that come from that same matrix or the same block.
Talk a little bit about the tools that you use in the carving of the marks, because there's a certain kind of size and shape to each mark. Not the same tool,
right,
but different tools. Can you talk about the tool and handling the tool and cutting?
Yeah, so typically, I guess the term for the types of tool are gouges, and so they come in various sizes or various widths. So sometimes they can be as small as like half of a millimeter to like 3 millimeters and so on. And so I like to have a variety of types of mark, and so that is related to like the variety of tools that I have. So if you look at this piece, there are some lines that are very, very delicate, so I'm using a smaller tool that has like a smaller edge to it, and then some of the lines are wider. And so I do that to control the value, I guess how light or how dark you see something is in the image. So where I want the surface to appear darker, or there's like more of a shadow happening on the figure, I would use a smaller tool. Or just leave it, just black or activate it as just the surface of the block. And then where there may be more light coming into the figure, you use a wider tool, or you carve away more from that section to create this sense of volume and form. So that's kind of a nutshell in terms of the tools.
So if they can imagine having that large sheet of wood, an image transferred onto that sheet of wood in reverse, correct?
Actually, I don't reverse my images.
It reverses when it prints.
Yeah, when it prints. That's another element of surprise.
Reverse, but some artists will reverse it prior to the drawing, but LaToya is saying that she cuts it as it is and it reverses when she prints, correct? Can you talk about making mistakes and overcuts or miscuts? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well,
does that ever happen?
All the time. All the time. So whenever I'm teaching printmaking to other people, I always say, when in doubt, don't cut it out. So if you don't know what you're doing, like you want to have a good game plan. So for me, that's where the drawing is so important. So I take a lot of time developing the drawing before I even start the cutting, because it gives me a clear pathway that helps me understand how I'm going to navigate through the piece. Now sometimes, you have to make adjustments as you're working, but if you do make a mistake, you just have to, that's where the problem solving comes in, right? So you have to find a way to make it work. And I think that's kind of synonymous with life. right? So we have all these moments and these instances, and sometimes we make mistakes, and then you have to decide, okay, I made this mistake, how can I move past it? What can I do to correct it?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that it's a process, and it's moving to a certain kind of progress as well, and that it's not a perfect process, and that it may not be exactly as you had imagined it, but you can always affect it so that it is a successful print. Is that correct? And the motives for printing this scale versus smaller scales, and I imagine you're doing all the lifting, right, and all the printing, right?
Yeah,
so it's labor intensive.
Yeah, I enjoy relief because I can do it by myself. Yeah.
And it's labor intensive.
Right. Yeah, so the scale, I'm just really drawn to doing large work. And I think that's kind of been present throughout all stages of my development as an artist, from like undergrad to graduate school. But part of that is, I guess, kind of thinking about this idea of invisibility. I feel like sometimes, at least from my experience as a Black woman, you kind of feel like seen and like overly observed and invisible at the same time. And so when I have these pieces in this space or a gallery space, when you encounter this piece, there's no way you can ignore that. Whereas if you see this woman walking down the street, you may discount her or ignore her in some way. But in this particular space and in this particular setting, at this particular scale, there's no way that you can be denied, right? They're bold, they're in your face. And for me, it's also a way to show my admiration for them. So, you know, and literally giving them the ability to take up space.
Yeah, don't say too much more about that because that's my next question.
Okay.
But before I get to the next question, I want to talk about the emotionality, the experience you're having. So you have this wood, this surface, this matrix. You charge it up with ink. You have your virgin sheet of paper ready to go. And it's moving through the press. What happens when it comes out the other end? You're emotional because it's labor intensive at the front end. But as it is coming out and exiting the press, and you begin to pull that sheet of paper off, can you talk about that emotional experience?
You say a prayer that you...
You say a prayer.
Yeah, there's always this like anticipation. So almost like, I don't know, for me, it's kind of like I'm holding my breath. And as I am lifting it up, because you only see part of the image come off the piece at a time, especially, I guess, because my work is so large. It's being unveiled to me as it kind of goes through the press and as I'm lifting things off. And so, like as I mentioned before, the paper is large. So I kind of have this whole, I guess, ballet, I would say, of how I'm working in the studio. It's very, like a very orchestrated process. And so I have this, you know, it really flows well each step because I do the process over and over again. So I'm able to, as it goes through the press, I'm able to lift it up by the corners. Then I can sort of gracefully and carefully transfer it to the board and pin it up so then I can like observe it and, you know, decide if it's a good print or if I think it's, you know, I need to pull another or, you know.
Well, it's clear that you're extremely gifted at this process and you've mastered it. Briefly, before I go to my next question, can you talk about some of the problems that can occur in that process? For example, lap marks from a roller, or the pressure of the press, or the shifting of the blankets, those things that help you create this impression on the matrix. Can you talk about kinds of problems that have happened that you have to be mindful of?
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier about it's kind of a problem solving. And just with the nature of printmaking, there's so many steps involved. There's steps that are involved in just preparing your block. There's steps involved in tearing the paper. There's steps involved in like setting up your press. So there's so many variables. And so you really just have to keep a good record of everything you do. So like, for example, a common problem that could happen is like under-inking the block, right? So I personally like to have nice, rich, saturated color. So it's very important for me that I'm heavily inking the block, but at the same time, not inking it so much that the lines start to bleed and close.
Yeah, you can't read the surface of the wood, right.
And so I kind of just I have a system. So I have like, understand like how many passes I'm gonna do one way, then I turn it the other way. So I do all four sides and there's a certain number of times. So I kind of have a, you know, to keep a count. And so once I'm like doing the proofing, that's kind of where you're testing everything out until you get the right combination of everything. So when I have that good proof, I have to keep a memory of everything that I did to to get to that stage and then make sure that I do that same thing every time for each print, because you want them to be the same, right? That's kind of the whole thing of the edition.
Well, the reason I'm drawing you out in that regard is that the audience often thinks that a print is just a reproduction, that it's mechanical, that it doesn't involve the hand or the heart or the mind in the level that it does. But these are original, authentic prints that are works of art. So this is why I wanted LaToya to give you more and more information about it. It's just not a reproduction. It is a fine work of art. Now, I want to broaden the conversation just a bit more. I believe art making, this is my statement, fundamentally represents a solution or an answer to the maker of the work of art. How has art making or print making been a solution for you?
I would say I think of myself as a creative in general, not just in the visual arts, but I think every part of myself, whether that's like, I see my hair as a medium. In the kitchen, I see the food that I create as a medium. So taking, leftovers and then making a meal, that's wonderful. Like, I feel like creativity is a part of every aspect of my life. And so you're always in this constant state of problem solving. And that's something that I really try to push in the classroom, because I teach drawing. As I mentioned, I'm a professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And oftentimes I have to teach drawing to students who don't really see the purpose. Maybe they're photography students or they're film students. But the way I can connect with them is that, yeah, you may not, be doing drawing, but you can develop your problem-solving skills. And I think that's what creation is for me. But it's also an outlet, and it's a part of who I am. And I feel like we're all artists and all creators in some capacity, whether you're a baker, right? Your mediums are the flour, the sugar. You have to have a science of how those things work together. You have to know how to mix it, and it takes time to perfect your favorite dish. Or whether you're a hairstylist, you have to have an understanding of the medium, the products that you're using, how that's going to affect the client that you're working on. So there's this kind of knowledge of materials that really has to happen. And so that's kind of where the problem solving comes in. But I see that as a part of every part of myself, not just an artist.
So I think you're saying, from what I glean from what you're saying, is that you are mastering a number of methods that have to do with creation, mastering them and controlling them and producing something that doesn't exist already.
Right.
Something that might be absent. It could be the quality of something. It could be food, as you mentioned. It could be hair. You seem to want to make something known that may not be so obvious to us. And even in your work, I mean, you've done super large pieces of the entire family. You're saying to the world, because you are speaking to an audience, you're not just making this for your own self and sliding it under the bed and no one's seeing it. You're having a relationship with that audience, and you want the audience to understand what? About you and about your practice.
Yeah, I see the themes that I express in my work as specific and universal. I feel oftentimes people come into spaces and unfortunately they aren't able to see reflections of themselves. That was my experience as thinking about my experience in academia specifically. So going to art classes and art history classes and not ever being able to see reflections of myself. And so I feel like that's what I want my art to do. So thinking about the other artists who their first encounters allowed me to see a reflection of myself that made me want to continue to pursue art and explore things. So I kind of think about my first time being exposed to Elizabeth Catlett's work. Like, I was doing art and doing drawings, but seeing her work gave me an extra purpose, and it helped refine and define what I wanted to say with my practice, right? Because we all make in some way, and I always knew I wanted to draw and I like to do those things, but seeing her work in other artists gave me a reason why. And so it's really to present the multifacetedness of what it means to be a Black woman, and also giving people an opportunity to see themselves within us. Because I think oftentimes, we're forced or encouraged or expected to see ourselves in other people. We're, kind of encouraged to assimilate to other things or to be able to relate to other things. But a lot of times people feel like when it has a label of Blackness on it, it's something that is not for them. But I feel like anybody could be able to look at my work and see a reflection of themselves in it.
So in a way, it's some self-authority, isn't it? Self-assertion. I've often thought about David Driskell and his practice as an art historian and a curator, and I often thought that it was a strategy to assert value over African-American artists so that he would also be valued. If they're valued, I'm valuable. If you're showing images that are valuable, and collectible, then you are also valuable, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah, I would say, yeah, definitely. And again, it's just to show the beauty that is there. And I used to kind of come from a place of trying to prove that, and I wouldn't say it's that anymore. It's I am these things, the people in my community embody these things, and I'm presenting these things to you, and hopefully you'll be able to see yourself in the work as well.
And it's not apologetic for who you are.
Right.
It's a celebration of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you another question.
Okay.
I'll try to go deeper if I can, all right? We talked about the work as an answer to a question or a solution to a problem, and I think you've answered it in your own way, how it reflects you, how it asserts the validity of self, a portrayal of self that has value in the marketplace, the public space. How has a solution represented or embodied your identity as a woman and as an African American specifically?
In the last, I would say this last year or two, I've been really kind of tapping into my identity, not only as an artist, but as a mother. And I think that has become like really clear and evident through the work. And I guess the solution was being able to acknowledge that part of myself. Because that's something that I specifically tried to hide or didn't want to kind of bring forth in my work in my earlier years, especially when my children were really young. So that was kind of something I shied away from just because of, I don't know, I just think of how we view like motherhood and also kind of assumptions about women artists who are mothers, that they're not going to be able to thrive in their practice. Or, you know, thinking about so many women who feel like they had to choose, right? I want to be an artist, but I have to choose my family because I can't do both. And so part of my goal is to show that it's possible. So I've been really open about sharing that part of myself, presenting all of myself through my work. So I think that's kind of where the idea of the solution comes in. And just it's been really affirming for me to hear other people and see how they have been inspired by the work as well. And so I guess the piece in particular that I am talking about is carving out time. You mentioned like the really large work. So I basically did a woodcut that went through my entire day from start to finish. So showing myself as a mom and practicing artist. Yeah, just really to show that, and give people a look at the interior. I think sometimes we, again, have perceptions about people, but, you know, we all have the same goals and same visions, the same aspirations, but I think they sometimes come out different aesthetically. They may look different, but at the core, they're the same. And so with that piece, I really wanted to put that aspect of myself on display. It was also kind of a celebration of the Black family, which a lot of times you don't see presented in gallery spaces and on this, you know, grand celebratory scale.
Yeah, when I first saw the piece you're talking about with your kids and family, I said, wow, this is intense, you know? So let me ask you another question. You've been receiving quite a bit of recognition for your work lately, and my understanding you received an international award not too long ago.
I was nominated for one.
Nominated for one. Didn't you meet the Queen of...
the Queen of Norway.
Norway, yes, based on your work and achievements, right? So it's international in its implications. It's not, and you mentioned this earlier, it's not just your particular story, but your particular story has universal implications. And I think that can be the most important art, how it transcends your own story and becomes our story. Can you talk about that a little bit, your role as an artist in the community?
Yeah, I think with all of our roles, and artists in particular, we're like a mirror to society, right? So we show, it's outward-facing and inward-facing at the same time. So the artist has a particular way of being able to talk about things that are happening in society. Sometimes we are able to present it in a comical way, in a critical way, but it becomes a lens that we are able to show ourselves to each other. And I think a lot of the things that I've, again, have been thinking about myself, they're like outward facing. So there are things that people are able to connect to and relate to. And I think just thinking about the shifts and changes that are happening in the art world, particularly in museum spaces, they're really trying to think about how to diversify and how to bring in work that people want to see, not just who you would typically expect to be visiting a museum space. So it's bringing new ideas, new voices, and just different perspectives and showing different walks of life.
And we're faced with a time where there's a lot of attention for works by artists of color, especially images that portray people of color. The market is very interested in it. There seems to be a consumption of that material. I have a friend who's an artist who's described it as very exotic and erotic, that the market is interested in this regard. How do you negotiate or navigate that territory of institutions that want your work based upon how it will be perceived by the public versus how you perceive yourself in your practice? I mean, does it at all limit you to be presented by an institution as a woman of color before you're presented as a woman that is an artist?
That's a loaded question, Curlee.
This is a good question. If it's causing you to pause for a moment, it's a good question.
Well, I would say I don't separate those parts of myself. And I think because I see Blackness as something that is celebratory, I don't have a problem being called a Black African-American artist because that's what I am. You should not have to ignore that in order to accept my work. And I feel like that way about people from other cultures as well. If I see this person's work, they're showing their culture. If it's, I appreciate that culture for what it is. So I don't like the idea of color blindness. You should not have to forget that I'm Black in order to accept me. You should see me, that part of myself, and see my work. And again, you should still be able to see yourself in the work. And I think a part of that, again, is the work of diversifying collections, diversifying museums, even in academia, as educators, who are we showing students? What artists are we showing them? Because the people that we show them in the classroom are the people that they're going to study for their thesis projects, and they're the people that they're going to be inspired by. So I think if we are going to start the change, we have to again show people that there's other people making work from all different types of cultures. So for me, it doesn't. I feel like you need my work in your space.
Need to hear that story. Need
Yeah,
to see that vision.
yeah, I think you need my work in your spaces because there are people who are longing to see those types of images. So I don't see it as a derogatory thing either way. I feel like my Blackness, that's who I am, and I can celebrate it and appreciate it, and you should too.
Now, is there a question that I didn't ask you that you want me to ask you?
I don't know.
I should leave you alone right now. I'd like maybe one or two questions from the audience. We're not supposed to do Q&A, but I know some of you really want to ask LaToya some questions, and you'll be able to come up and talk to her right after. But there's a question you have? So the question is how the drawings provide a source of emotions before the woodcut is made and cut, because it's present, you can see it, and how the drawings contribute to that.
I would say drawing is the foundation of everything that I do. And so really strengthening my drawing practice helps me in every aspect. I would say in terms of my image formation, I work from observation. I don't really draw well just out of my head. And I think that sense of observation and the skill that I built up, just, the knowledge of drawing, knowledge of light and shadow, the knowledge of observation, it really comes through the work. Also, most of the people in my work I know personally, so I think I'm able to connect with them in a different type of way. And for me, it's also when I do a portrait of someone, it's a way of honoring them. So I really want to feel like I'm doing the piece justice. And so I think all those things kind of working together. There's the technical aspect of just being really well-versed in drawing, just drawing media in general, but also the sense of observation and care that I'm putting into the work. I think that kind of comes out, and you got to kind of get the spirit of the relationship that I have with the person, or the admiration that I have for the person.
Yes, one other question that I have to bring it to a close.
My question is, when you're making your larger images, are you using oil-based inks as opposed to a water-based ink because you have more time to work with it? So you have a preference?
Yeah, I prefer oil-based ink for all the things that the work that I'm doing. And that kind of comes at the end stage. So in terms of like the image development, like ink doesn't come until the very last stage when you're thinking about like traditional printmaking. But yeah, I think the oil-based ink the benefit is that it doesn't dry very quickly. So if I'm doing like an edition of 15, I don't always have to like worry about my ink drying out on the slab. But it also just coats the paper really well. This has this like really nice richness. I tend to work with a lot of images that kind of have black space in them, as you see with this one. And so the coverage ability of oil-based ink, I think, is really well. But it doesn't really necessarily benefit like the image formation itself. That really comes to like my drawing tools, the type of wood that I'm using, the type of tools that I'm carving with. Those things are more important on the front end, and then the ink is kind of more on the end part of the development of the work. Favorite paper. So I do a lot of work with Reeves VFK. So I kind of go back and forth between like Japanese papers. They tend to just work well with wood cutting because they receive the ink really well, and also because I work so large, sometimes it can be kind of hard to work with cotton papers. And then, especially if I'm printing by hand, I'm able to just work it really easily with working with a Japanese paper. But if I'm going to work with cotton paper, my go-to is Reeves BFK.
Also, that ink kit is very sensuous and actually will make sounds as you're rolling it. So the ink actually talks to you during the process.
Yeah, that's another
But I'm
way.
going to bring it to a close now.
Yeah.
And I'm going to close it by acknowledging with great confidence that the first international exposure of LaToya's work in Costa Rica was arranged by the David C. Driskell Center in 2012 when I was a director. So we are responsible for her career. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Come up and read her if you like, please.
All right, everybody, this is going to get really cozy. As you can see, we have a great turnout. If you are able to stand up for the second part of this conversation, please do so, so we can let people that might need the seat. We will reconvene here at 6 p.m. 6 p.m.
Welcome to the second part of our program this evening. My name is David Conway. I'm the archivist at the Driskell Center. That's my great honor. I've been asked to remind anyone who doesn't need to sit, who can stand during the program, to be mindful of anyone who may need a seat. Thank you. We'll just wait a few more seconds. All right, thank you. Please join me in welcoming back to the podium the Center's director, Professor Curlee Raven Holton.
Thank you so much. So I hope we can keep this excitement going, and it's great that you're here, because this is not, it's not possible for us to complete the process without your presence. It's not just the making of the art or the presenting of the art, but it's your being here that makes this very special. I often describe the Driskell Center as being in the business of honoring artists, honoring work and honoring us. The Driskell Center is honored to present the opening lecture of the Porter Colloquium. This has been a valued tradition in honor of David C. Driskell and his legacy that was born at Howard University. A special acknowledgement to Dr. Melanie Harvey, chair of James A. Porter Colloquium and African American Art, who worked with us to arrange tonight's event. Also, let me take the opportunity to express my deep appreciation to the Driskell Center team. David, who just introduced me, Ella, Tamara, Kristen, Karina, and Clea. They have been devoted to the spirit and mission of the center in ways that continues to support our relevancy as a unique and innovative cultural institution. This day of cultural and intellectual celebration began with a stimulating conversation with the acclaimed artist LaToya Hobbs. And that residency and visit and talk had been facilitated by the art department. I think we have someone from the art department here. Oh, in the back. The art department and, of course, the dean's office as well, of arts and humanities. A special welcome to our guests that include members of the Driskell family, Thelma Driskell, as well as Daphne and Davreen Driskell. And you'll meet the young granddaughter of David Driskell, Alicia, who's become a member of our advisory board. We're very proud of that, keeping that tradition going. But also, I want to acknowledge the artists that are with us tonight. Very special artists. Ben Jones, where's Ben at? All right. Willie Cole. Willie Cole is up front here. And we're waiting for Mel Edwards to make a major entrance, but he's not here yet. And of course, a special, oh, Mel, all right. I'm not gonna ask him to come up and talk, he'll never get it done. You see, he snuck in without me seeing him. But you know, Mel, we received this major gift from the Mellon Foundation to commission Mel to do a monumental sculpture that will be in honor of David C. Driskell, that will be in the front of the Driskell Center, and the university's made a commitment to create a plaza to house that sculpture. So we're going to be honored by that. So this is great for Mel. And we paid him more than minimum wage to do this. So. Also, we have with us the inaugural recipient of the David C. and David G. Driskell Award for Creative Excellence, just established this year. Lucy, is Lucy in the audience here? From Chile. I might have her stand up here. Lucy is completing her PhD in art history at the University of Texas at Austin. She'll be here for 3-week residencies, working in the center's archives on Afro-Brazilian art practices and histories, and governmental sanctioned initiatives that promoted Afro-Brazilian art during the Brazilian military dictatorship. It is also my pleasure and honor now to introduce our distinguished lecturer in the opening event of Howard's 33rd Annual Porter Colloquium. Dr. Jordana Morris-Agis is Professor of American Art. She is an award-winning scholar whose research focuses on modern and contemporary American art with the emphasis on expressions of Blackness. Professor Saggisi's first two books have centered on the work of contemporary American artist Jean-Michel Basquiat, one of the most popular yet critically overlooked artists of the 20th century. This book was recognized as an exceptional first book by the Penn Center in USA in 2015 and was reissued in paperback in April 2021. Professor Saggisi is a Jean-Michel Basquiat reader. Writing interviews and critical responses will be published by the University of California Press of the award-winning Documents of Contemporary Art series. In addition to her achievements as an art historian and author, she has contributed articles to publications such as Art Journal, the International Review of African American Art, Journal of Contemporary Art, Exposure, the Art Forum, as well as international publications. She has lectured in renowned institutions such as Columbia and Princeton universities. She has been interviewed on public radio in the US and the UK. Dr. Saggisi's forthcoming book, Heavyweight, Black Boxes and the Fight of Representation, maps the visual terrain on racial ideology in the United States, paying particular attention to the intersecting discourses of blackness, masculinity, and sport in the late 19th century. This new research has been sorted by the Mellon Bruce Senior Visiting Fellowship for the Center of Advanced Study in Visual Arts, National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the University of Maryland's Independent Scholarship and Research Creativity Awards. Professor Saggisi teaching is informed by her interest in history of photography, print culture, abstraction, conceptual art, performance art, post-colonial theory, and disability studies. Professor Saggisi offers courses in American art from the colonial period to present, African American art, and critical race art history. At the graduate level, she currently teaches the required methods seminar for the department, as well as special topic seminars in American art, athletic turned sports, and American art in the fall of 2019. An example of this exceptional scholarship and mentorship that Dr. Saggisi provides to her students is evidenced by this exhibition that surrounds us. Ringo and Sar, Meeting on the Matrix, was organized by her PhD student group, organized, curated, and now working on a catalog for the exhibition. I would also like to take this opportunity to mention that she will be talking about this year's distinguished lecture subject will be This Is Not a Drill, Performance, Endurance, and the Black Body in Public Space. But before I do that, I'd like to take this opportunity as well to introduce you to the next director of the David C. Driskell Center, Dr. Saggisi, which will begin the new directorship on July 1st, 2023. This makes me think of when George Bush, when Obama was elected and George Bush was in front of the White House and Obama was coming to a change guard and he was just dancing on the steps. I don't know if you saw that. I wanted to do a little jig, but I'm not going to do that. Not only is she a brilliant scholar, she is also will be a brilliant director. Dr. Saggisi brings to her new role a body of scholarship and African American art history, as well as a passion for teaching the next generation of scholars. The maestro would have been pleased with this selection. Dr. Saggisi.
Good evening. There's a lot of y'all. And I hope you'll forgive me for turning down the lights. I'll try to keep you awake. It's just so that we can see the images a little bit more clearly tonight. I want to start us off with a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen by European colonists. We pay respects to the Piscataway peoples, their elders and ancestors, and I'd like to ask you to please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. Before I begin, I also just want to briefly acknowledge that each of you has arrived here tonight with your own unique life experiences. And this will undoubtedly contribute to the way you perceive several types of information. During tonight's lecture, I will address historical subjects and visual images that may be emotionally challenging or disturbing to some, and this includes nudity, as well as references to racist violence, including slavery. If you find that any of this causes personal distress, don't worry. I encourage you to take a break. I won't be offended. If you need to step out. What might that be? Or take any other steps that you need to preserve your well-being. All right. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Curlee for that incredibly generous introduction. And I will be happy to talk with you after my lecture about how thrilled I am to step into this exciting role as the next director of the David C. Driskell Center. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to speak with you tonight about my newest research. And when I say new, I mean new, right? And especially so in the context of this distinguished lecture. I know that for me, as well as for many of you, David was a mentor for my own studies of African American art. He made his reputation as both an artist and a historian by blending the personal with the professional. His contacts with artists informed not only his creative practice, but his scholarship. And we're lucky to have his archives here in the Driskell Center, and those papers, as we go through them, attest to the enormous scope and impact of David's work. My lecture tonight, fittingly, perhaps, focuses on an artist who also benefited from David's mentorship, first as a student and later as a colleague. Born in Washington, D.C., Jefferson Pender received both his BA in theater and his MFA in mixed media from the University of Maryland at College Park. He actually taught here as an assistant professor from 2003 until 2011. As an interdisciplinary artist, Pender gained national attention via his inclusion in the exhibition Frequency, organized by Thelma Golden at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2006. His work has been featured in numerous solo and group shows, including exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Wadsworth Atheneum, the High Museum, the National Gallery of Art, the Tate Modern. In 2017, Pender received a Guggenheim Fellowship. He also won a 2016 USA Joyce Fellowship Award in the field of performance art. And most recently, in 2021, he was named a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow. Over the last 2 decades, Pender has worked across theater, performance, sculpture, and more. I first met him in 2008, right after encountering this video, 2006 Juke, at the Patricia Sweeto Gallery in San Francisco. The title for my lecture tonight, however, is a play on Pender's performance, This Is Not a Drill, which he presented as a limited run engagement in the summer of 2019, the 100-year anniversary of the violent uprising known as the Red Summer. And this was a performance that was actually made here in Washington, D.C. In 2019, and was an occasion for another encounter, luckily for me, with Jefferson and his work. Throughout this performance, Pender and other performers probe into techniques like close order drills, shooter drills, boxing, and bow staff training to explore the potentials of communal strength through ritualized physical routines. He's drawing here on training techniques used by groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, and Marine Corps. This is not a drill, revealed some of the main points of what I see as the constellation that composes his diverse practice. These include the Black body, endurance, and the connections between the physical and our emotional world. Given the diversity of his practice, I'm going to focus tonight on just 4 works by Pender, and they are, in chronological order, Mule from 2006, Passive Resistance from 2008, Thoroughbred from 2014, and most recently, Monumental. My investigation into these works, and indeed into Pender's practice at large, centers on their deployment of the Black body in performance and their engagement with the concept of endurance. More specifically, I argue that Pender's explorations of the intersections between the real and the imagined possibilities of the Black body in turn provide a counter-argument to the historical myths of Black exceptionalism. So for more than 400 years, Black people in the United States have been haunted by this specter of physicality. This is starting in the 17th century, right? This rhetoric of physical superiority that in part provided the justification for the enslavement of generations of Africans in the diaspora. And after emancipation, Black men specifically were subject to the intersecting discourses of both gender and race, frequently cast as mentally feeble laborers who benefited from the guidance and control of an overwhelmingly exclusionary public policy. We might argue that the stereotype of physical prowess is a precondition of anti-Blackness. And here I'm showing you just 2 things on the screen. You know, this an article from The Guardian that was talking about sort of this idea of the natural talent, right, of Black athletes. And on the right, you're looking at a quote here by Jimmy the Greek, a radio personality who was fired for this comment, right? I'm talking again about this Black exceptionalism. They're natural, they can do anything. We could argue that framing the Black body as one immune to pain is a precondition of white supremacy. And we've seen this materialize in various forms over the last century, from the surgical experiments performed without anesthesia on enslaved Black women in the 1840s, to even a more recent 2016 survey of second-year medical students in which 40% endorsed a belief that, quote, Black people's skin is thicker than white people's, end quote. 2016. In my most recent book, Heavyweight, I look specifically at images of Black athletes, not only as art objects, but also as cultural artifacts. And in this book, I'm really working from this idea put forward by Stuart Hall in 1997, his lecture, Representation and the Media. And in that lecture, he clarifies the difference between sort of a common understanding of representation, right, sort of representing what is already there, and his understanding of representation. And this is what he says. He talks about representation as entering into the constitution of the object that we are talking about. It is part of the object itself. It is constitutive of it. It is one of its conditions of existence, and therefore representation is not outside the event, not after the event, but within the event itself. Hall's basically arguing here that images that circulate in the media illustrate the ways that the ways in which Black bodies are viewed by audiences, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, and this is a pattern that connects back even to Reconstruction era expressions of white mainstream anxieties and potential fantasies about the Black body. Working from Hall's definition of representation, I've considered the ways in which images of Black male boxers, I could talk about this photograph for hours, constitute the definition and the experience of Black masculinity, and how these representations work to position Black men as ambivalent objects of both our fear and our desire. That book's central concern, that is how Black men become the most threatening of all, has very real consequences in the present. So consider, for example, the proliferation, right, of murder by unarmed Black men, by the police, that have become an intrinsic and disturbing part of our visual landscape over the last decade. In the years that have passed since the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, we've all been witness to a relentless explosion of anti-Black violence. We've been compelled to watch, via the somewhat chilling availability of video footage, the murders of unarmed boys and men, right, by police ad infinitum. So we've seen this happen over and over again. They're collective crimes, right? Selling loose cigarettes, walking on a public street, playing with a toy, holding a knife, driving with a non-functioning brake light, paying for a pack of cigarettes with a counterfeit bill, sleeping in a car, quickly escalated by officers who immediately and tragically identified them as a threat. So I say all of this to talk about sort of the stereotype of physical prowess, the threat of the Black male body in public space is without a doubt a precondition, right, of anti-Black violence. Jefferson Pender has spoken of his own use of the body, and we might imagine, in this case, the bodies of others that he uses in performance, as, quote, a tool and a weapon. The weaponizing of the body is one way that these performances resist the more typical binary of active performer and passive viewer. In viewing these performances, we are made complicit in these acts as we witness these bodies work themselves to exhaustion, struggling to keep up, or maybe even overcome by gravitational force for an undetermined amount of time. And we can argue that the true subject of these works is endurance, defined most simply as an ability to persist within a difficult situation or to continue to act despite a wound or fatigue. Across this series of performances categorized by Pender as part of his inertia cycle, we witness him running, riding a stationary bike, moving an inert vehicle with a mass of pedestrians, rowing, or running through the streets of Minneapolis. And in all of these, we are forced to consider the limits of the body. In the words of scholar Isaiah Wooden, who wrote about Ben-Hur, the piece you're looking here on the screen, Pender, quote, provides a literal platform to rehearse and enact various forms of non-compliance, end quote. As each performer tries to execute the task before them, they do so in opposition to the obstacles they face. As they strive to endure these taxing physical feats, in this case rowing, their ability to persist may in fact speak to the challenge Black bodies present to the oppressive structures and systems that attempt to limit them. These works, in Pender's words, quote, explore physicality and intense exertion as relating to the Black body, end quote. They portray the theatrics of physical labor. And they are also, in part, ultimate refusals of the pressures to endure. I am interested in these performances by Jefferson Pender because they explicitly focus on the intersections between what I've called those real and imagined possibilities of Black athleticism. In the 2006 performance Mule, for example, Pender films his journey down a Baltimore sidewalk while dragging a weight. This is a 300-pound log covered with tin from a chain that's attached to a chest harness. Under the harness, the artist wears a gray suit and tie, as well as a pair of goggles that he's modified to restrict his vision so that he can only see what appears directly in front of him. He begins the route almost standing upright and leaning forward at an acute angle, and other shots of the performance show Pender moving closer and closer to the ground on hands and knees in an attempt to create that sufficient force to displace the weight. In conjunction with the quote-unquote blinders Pender wears, he is not quite transformed throughout the performance of Mule. into a beast of burden. And here again, the body becomes a site of struggle, as the performance makes visible the weight of stereotype. 2 years after Mule, Pinder filmed Passive Resistance, a collaboration. And here we see the two-channel video that was presented with a left view with Pinder himself on the left, and the right view with Matt Ravenstall, who is his collaborator for this particular work. I'm going to play, hopefully, a short clip from this for you so you can see exactly what's happening in this performance. So as the video begins, both men look toward a center line. There's actually, in this video, no sound for the first 10 seconds. That is until we see and hear that white hand enter the left video and slap Pinder's face with an open hand. As the hand makes contact, we have that loud snap. And Pinder's face moves in the direction of his hand with his eyes briefly closing. However, just as quickly as the slap occurs, Pinder opens his eyes and returns to his opening position. There's a pause for just 3 seconds before Ravenstall strikes again, this time from the opposite side, and the pattern repeats again and again. If you are able to watch for the duration of the video, which is 5 minutes, 10 seconds, you will see Pinder slapped a total of 83 times. No discernible pattern emerges regarding the side of the face to receive the blow or their pacing. In fact, after the first 4 minutes, the speed of delivery increases significantly, seemingly without reason. Although the facial expression of the white figure does not change over the course of the performance, we do witness Pinder react, right? We briefly see him close his eyes. In other cases, he will lick his lips. He offers several deep exhales. He even scans the body of his so-called opponent and even smirks a few times. A challenge to view either in part or as a whole, the video becomes the most uncomfortable when the quote-unquote beatdown comes to an end and both performers turn their gaze toward the camera. According to Pinder, passive resistance, quote, demonstrates the heroics and absurdity of the essence of the passive resistance techniques used in the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. But this performance also does something more. As viewers and indeed as witnesses to this scene, we are implicated in the violence before us. We are reminded of our role, as the scholar Lee Rayford has described, quote, in the constant mediated repetition of the Black body in pain for public consumption. Rayford's words were deployed in reference to lynching photographs, right, which circulated endlessly in the late 19th and early 20th century. These were visual testaments to public murder as well as evidence of white racialized anxiety. Pinder's performance as passive here is on its face a form of resistance, but the question becomes, what exactly is being resisted? So that quote from Pinder, he's reminding us that the 1960s resistance movement promoted passivity in the hope of avoiding further physical or psychological abuse. In the years before the emergence of the Black Panthers, who advocated for the open carry of legally issued guns, protesters across the Jim Crow South promoted nonviolent action, right, through freedom rides, boycotts, marches, and they do all this over, right, prioritizing an over-violent encounter. We see Pinder here in this work enact key principles, right, of Martin Luther King Jr.'s theories on nonviolence, which were, I'm putting up here, these were theories that were articulated in his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, which was published in 1958 as a memoir of the Montgomery bus boycott of 55 and 56. And in that particular book, what King is arguing for is nonviolence. He writes, "Those committed to nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation, as suffering itself can be redemptive," end quote. Of course, we all know that the suffering itself could lead toward death, right? As is the case for so many. With passive resistance, Pindar reconsiders the purpose as well as the overall effect of this endurance. As he turns to meet our gaze at the end of that video, it's as if to prove to us that passivity often fails to create justice. In Thoroughbred from 2014, Pindar continues to question the limits of endurance, focusing us on the failures of the Black body. Thoroughbred is, of course, a term used most often to describe the level of purity in a breed of horse, right? That is one specifically designed for racing. But the reference to animality in Pindar's adoption of the term for this is not incidental. For one, right, we might think of the ways in which enslaved Black men were once described as thoroughbreds at auction, as if to underscore that myth of innate physical strength. So you're looking here at a performance that took place inside a small Chicago gallery, Sector 2337, where Pindar has arranged 4 amateur runners on treadmills that the artist, via a handmade conversion kit, you can actually see him in the very back of that image in sort of a vest and dress shirt. He's sitting in front of a table where he has a sort of a handmade control box, right? And there are dials connected to each of these 4 treadmills that he can turn on, speed up, and turn off at will. And each of these treadmills, he's equipped with this clamp-on floodlight, which he cannot tell me what kind it was, because who asks such questions besides art historians, that turns off and on in sync with the running belt of the machine, right? So once the machine starts, the light comes on. Once they stop the machine, the light turns off. So at the start of the performance, the lights of the gallery dim and the lamps turn on. This incandescent light bathes the torso of each figure, creating a visual analog to classical sculpture, as we're allowed to trace the contours and the shadows of these bodies before us. After the ring of a single bell, Pindar activates the sequence of treadmills. He starts from the front and works to the back. And as they begin to move, each performer, this is your warning, disrobes to reveal a body that is completely nude, save a pair of sneakers. So I'm going to play a clip of this performance. So I'm not going to show you the whole performance because essentially, as you'll see as I talk about it, the point is that it's a really long performance, right? It ends when the last runner is exhausted, okay, and is unable to continue. So as you can see here, they actually begin in unison. They pump their arms, right, of these nude bodies. We see them inhaling and exhaling in a slow march that eventually transforms into a brisk walk. At each subsequent ring of the bell, the speed continues to increase and the paces and abilities of each body begin to diverge. Individual runners begin to struggle with the pace, and eventually, one by one, they stop the moving belt and extinguish their lights. While we may be interested as viewers to see which runners prevail, I won't reveal, the point in Thoroughbred is it is not their ability to resist that exhaustion. The point instead is that none possibly can. Here, these bodies, and we might argue all Black bodies, counter the stereotype of inhuman or even bestial strength through their eventual and expected failure. This nudity allows us not only to witness the movement of their individual limbs as they complete these tasks, but also to contend with the explicitly human form. So, I'm an art historian, right? I'm thinking about a long history of American art, and when I'm encountering work like with Pindar, I'm thinking about how does this fit, right, within a history that we already have, right? A history of performance that is long, right? It goes all the way back to the early 20th century, right, in Europe. And one of the things that I'm often sort of thinking about is this, right? We have a long history of endurance-based performance. And this is specific to contemporary American art, and they're evaluated most often on the subject's ability to resist pain. This was an extremely rich mode of art production in the 1970s, where a class of artists, mostly white men, explored endurance by putting their own bodies at risk. So this is one example. You're seeing here a shirtless Dennis Oppenheim, who lay in direct sun on the sand of Jones Beach for 4 to 5 hours with a book splayed across his chest so that the spine faces upward. And the resulting photographs from the performance showed the two phases of Oppenheim's performance, right? In the top image, you're seeing the book that's actually titled Tactics, Cavalry, Artillery, atop the artist's torso, while in the lower image, you're seeing the result, right, of that sun exposure recorded in the rectangle of pale skin that takes the place in the shape of the book once removed. In this same period, the Los Angeles-based artist Chris Burden became infamous for exposing his body to violence, right? And so you're looking here at a performance, Shoot, right, where he directed an assistant to shoot him in the arm with a .22 caliber rifle. And again in 1974, where a shirtless Burden was attached to the rear of a VW Beetle with 2 nails hammered to his open palms and through the car's roof. This is a work called Transfixed from 1974. And in the work I Like America and America Likes Me, the German immigrant artist Joseph Beuys spent 3 consecutive days, 8 hours at a time, locked inside a small room at the René Bloch Gallery. The room contained heaps of straw, several copies of the Wall Street Journal from each day, and Beuys, as you can see here on the screen, wrapped himself in a large piece of felt and held a wooden cane, which he used both to interact with and to defend against the room's only other inhabitant, and that was a wild coyote. While perhaps a bit eccentric or even dangerous on its surface, according to Beuys, the coyote represented the spirit of America. Many of the performance works from this period have been recognized by critics for their direct engagement of politics, right? So if you're looking in the case of Oppenheim, critics have interpreted that choice of book, right, Tactics, as directly related to the strategic deployment of napalm by the United States Army in Vietnam, the burning of his own skin being perhaps an analog to the effects of chemical warfare. They draw a connection between the vulnerability of Oppenheim's body and other bodies under the influence of war-making governments. And as Beuys interacted with the coyote, its increasing passivity was interpreted as evidence of the healing power of cooperation and mutual understanding in a time of deep political divides. And of course, we have to consider these works in relation to pain. Okay, this is where it gets a little theoretical. In her 2005 book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, Sarah Ahmed enters into the relationship between politics and pain. That is, how does, in Ahmed's words, the labor of pain and the language of pain work in specific and determined ways to affect difference between bodies? Pain, she argues, is not necessarily a private experience, but it surfaces in relationship to others. That is, pain only exists via the recognition by someone else who witness it, right, and authenticate its existence, right? Anyone who has a toddler understands this concept, right? If you react, right, when they stumble, it's, oh my gosh, yes, this hurts, right? If you don't react, it's no big deal. Ahmed argues the following, quote, "The experience of pain does not cut off the body in the present, but attaches this body to the world of other bodies," end quote. So she's saying that pain introduces contingency. Perhaps more important, Ahmed suggests that more familiar narratives about pain reify normative standards of bodily integrity that are based on an idealized model, right? And this model is inherently raced, gendered, and sexualized. We assume this ideal, right? A white, heterosexual male subject whose bodily integrity is threatened by harmful external forces. These narratives reproduce discourses of oppression by positioning the right to voice one's pain and pain itself as an entitlement to which those in positions of privilege have greater access, right? So the question I'm asking here is, does the pain endured by Oppenheim mean something different than the pain endured by Pender? Before I conclude, I want to briefly touch on this work. This is the 2021 performance Monumental, a more recent contribution to what I introduced at the beginning, Pender's inertia cycle. This debuted at the Untitled Art Fair in Miami. And for the duration of the performance, Pender, dressed again in that gray suit with black tie and black shoes, hangs suspended from a harness over a wooden block that's been painted white. Atop this pedestal, which has been consciously shaped to resemble those all too familiar plinths supporting Confederate monuments, Pender cycles through a series of movements. He begins, as you see here on the screen, with his arms stretched out while his legs dangle vertically, before he transitions to a series of bicycle sort of running movements in which he raises one knee with the opposite arm and twists his torso. He returns to a vertical position again, right, this time with his arms arranged in that downward V shape, elevated just so slightly above his hips. And as he takes a brief exhale, Pender then repositions himself so that he holds his knees, right, in this slightly curved position. As he creates these poses and struggles to rebalance between them, we notice the signs of exertion on his face, and we see his chest rise and fall with each deep sigh. Here again, I would argue that he inserts himself into that long history, right, of Black embodiments of disobedience. And he's resisting here and refusing, right, the forces of gravity, the stares of the viewers, and a history of art that declares some bodies as monumental and others as inconsequential. Pender's work, more importantly, highlights the failures of a history of performance to consider the specific conditions of endurance and its relationship to pain when the subject, not to mention the viewer, is Black. I would like to borrow a phrase from Lee Rayford, whose study, as I mentioned before, of lynching photography, undoubtedly, right, a touch point in sort of the visual iconography you're looking here in Pender's Monumental. She's talking about, this constant mediated repetition of the Black body in pain for public consumption. But the key element to me in Pinder's performance is this refusal to even consider Black pain, right? We know that this conception of the body as incapable of suffering, right, is that underlying principle that continues to reverberate in our present moment. This is just another close-up image of Pinder as he hangs there for the duration of this performance. Working with sweat and making visible the struggle to meet these physical demands, Pinder disrupts the dominant understanding of the Black body as one incapable of suffering and immune to pain. We see in real time the endurance that is required not only to carry out these tasks, but also to exist in the world as a Black man, to continue living despite our collective fatigue. As these Black bodies exert themselves to the point of exhaustion, they do not demonstrate their strength as much as their humanity. And in doing so, they enact a refusal. They disobey, and they become unruly. So when I was starting this lecture, I was reading about the death of the 29-year-old Tyree Nichols, right? Who was pushed to the ground and kicked in the face and relentlessly attacked by 5 police officers for 13 excruciating minutes during a traffic stop. And I wonder, how do we continue to watch? How do we continue to breathe? As Bell Hooks reminds us, quote, changing representations of Black men must be a collective task. The work of Jefferson Pinder complicates a history of anti-Blackness that has true and often devastating consequences in our present. His performances bridge the gap between that physical and emotional life, presenting to us the problems of duration, pain, and failure, to explore the affective dimensions of what it means to endure. And maybe it is by pushing and by fighting and even by failing that we can find a way to live. Thank you. I've been told there are no questions. You just have to come find me. I'm just kidding. Is that true? We have to take some questions. Let's do it. Yes, please. Oh, monumental? It's about half an hour. Yeah, and it's you know, what was really interesting to me about Pinder, you know, because I was trying to make this in the talk, you know, I was really thinking a lot in the last few years about Black athletes. And one of the things that's really so striking about Pinder's work is sort of the extreme athleticism that is required to do his performances, right? And he's someone who is very committed to physically preparing and training for these tasks. He has a military background. He, you know, grew up here. But, you know, as you watch the performance, it doesn't matter how much training you have, right? And that is the really hard part, is the duration of the film, and you can see it, right? It's on Vimeo. The duration is really about sort of him necessarily failing and taking these breaks and wobbling, right? That's as much part of the performance as those sort of execution of those poses. Yeah.
How much do you consider the audience's reaction to that performance? Because I was there and
Yeah.
I got to witness Monumental. And when I say it was just incredibly exhausting, strenuous, difficult to witness and consider, it was hard. And as someone who admires Jefferson's work and a friend, it was hard.
Yes.
I cried almost the entire time. I want to cry now seeing it.
Yes.
But how much into what you interpret his work in terms of the endurance of the performance are you looking at the audience's reaction, also in relation to athletic performances where the audience is like, yeah, go, do this. Whereas, you know, the emotional reaction is different.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful question. And absolutely, I am interested particularly in Jefferson's performance, as a vehicle for me, right? To think through exactly what I was talking about, this binary between sort of an active performer and a passive viewer, right? That he relies on affect to draw us in a really interesting way. And, I might argue that the history that we currently have of performance art does not account as much as it could for that relationship, right, between the viewer and the participant. And part of that is because, we are trained to kind of think of the body and performance as sort of a neutral body, and we're sort of thinking about the audience as a universal audience. And what's interesting to me is exactly what you're talking about, is the relationship between the viewing by a viewer who is Black, right, is a person of color, is a victim of violence in their own lives, and someone who's coming from without, right? And I think that's one of the reasons, for me, I think that's one of the reasons that, Pinder's practice hasn't really been taken up historically or critically, is because it troubles that sort of relationship that we have to understand that viewer-performer binary. Yeah, it was a great question. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for Pinder, but who's born in 1970?
Yeah.
And Hotel was born in 1954. You spoke to Pinder, what's the relationship with Hotel?
I haven't spoken to Jefferson about Popal, but they are definitely operating in a similar space. I think that I've been thinking a lot about Popal's sort of Superman crawls, right, through New York, and that mule. And there's a couple of differences that I think gets back to your question too about why Jefferson's work is a little bit different and a little bit stranger. One thing I noticed is that, of course, he's adding a 300-pound log, right? He's literally transforming himself into a beast, right? Sort of those blinders on, the goggles. I think that's one thing that's a little bit different here. The other piece of it, and I think this is really one of the reasons why I'm interested in Pinder's work, is because unlike Popel's, where the work exists, and this is very typical of performance art, right? Like the performance is the performance, and the work that exists is like some photos that were hastily taken along the way, right, as you performed. And what's different about Jefferson's work is we have just this sleek video, right? This sort of record of the performance, and it has music and lighting. And this in part, attests to his background in theater, right? And so the question for me, in thinking about someone like Popel, right, who's working in performance and documentation, that's a really clear construction, and we have a way of understanding the relationship between the document and the performance. What we don't have with Pinder is a clear understanding, like of sort of the documentation versus the performance versus the video, the performance versus us watching it, right? There's a little bit, it sort of expands out in a way that I think at least I don't yet, have a way of really interpreting, right? So when I say this is new, I mean like new, right? I've been talking to Jefferson for a long time, and we were just in a conversation, and I said, I think you're ready for like a monograph. I think you're ready for someone to figure out what's going on here. And we really do, I think for a lot of artists, most recently we had a really lovely book come out about Carrie Mae Weems that no one could really handle, right, for the first couple of decades of her career. And I think it's because he's engaging in all of these various discourses at once around theater, performance, documentation, film, music, right, athleticism. And so this is my opportunity to kind of try to bring some of those threads together. Yeah. Yeah.
So I really appreciate that you bring in to experience Jefferson Pinder. You've helped us in a way in which I haven't really lifted him in that way, which is really good. So we need scholars like yourself and others to kind of lift this. I'm thinking of Daniela Fraser right now, because she was a bystander of a lynching. And you've helped me to kind of understand my own role as a viewer, my bystandership. And so right now I'm doing a lot of thinking about bystandership in policing. And so this is gonna kind of put me on a point of departure about you know, the role of the arts in helping us understand our better understanding of policy. So I'm really appreciating your lifting this for us.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that there's, you know, I would always recommend, I'm a teacher at heart, right? So I'm always gonna recommend things for you to read. So, you know, for me, you know, Teju Cole's Death in the Browser tab was really important for thinking through the circulation of images of violence and the ways that we kind of become conditioned to that. And I think, you know, one of the things that your comment brings up for me is something that I've been thinking about with Jefferson is, you know, the circulation of these performances, the circulation of these videos, right? Because he actually does very tightly control the documentation, right? And I think that that's intentional, right? Because there is something about, you know, as we were talking about before, it's difficult, right, to watch, it's painful. And I think that, you know, for a lot of artists that are working in this space, there's also a question of how much am I contributing to that visual imaginary, right? And how much am I critiquing it? And I think that, you know, that's a difficult balance, right, to strike, yeah.
I don't know if this is a question, but maybe you could help me clarify this thought. I was thinking about the difference between the emotional space and the physical space in Jefferson's work. So with the emotional space, he's kind of breaking the fourth wall and engaging empathy as a medium within the work. But then in the physical space, in the gallery setting, if you're looking at his work compared to Joseph Boyd's, the gallery frames it in this pristine environment, kind of like in Miami. Whereas when he's dragging the work through Baltimore, in Mule, and I'm thinking about maybe an artist like Anna Mendieta, who's in a natural environment outside. I'm thinking about the framing within the gallery versus the exterior physical space. Anyway, I'm just kind of processing.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a difference for me when I'm thinking about those performances that you mentioned, like Mendieta and Boys, because again, you have sort of that, there's an isolation, right? Mendieta is performing those for the camera, right? You know, with just one person taking those photographs. And Boys is similarly isolated, right, with just the coyote. And, you know, as much as maybe, I mean, Sector 237 is not a pristine space, so in Chicago at all. And part of it is that close physicality that you have. Like, if you look at, you know, installation shots of that, like, they're on the treadmill, like, as I'm in relationship, right, to this front row, right? So there isn't an ability for you to not be in the performance. And I think, you know, this goes back to Jefferson's, you know, training in theater, right? It's always this sort of, you know, participatory, you're always implicated, right, in the performance. And I think that he is always thinking about that, right? He's doing it, yeah, on the street or in the gallery, but he's almost never performing alone, right, for the camera. And that's really interesting to me, because that's not something that we see a lot in this type of performance. Yeah. I'm gonna let you all go. Thank you so much.
Please join us for a reception outside. You can
Get a drink, get some food.